Why is the mic already peaking? I have to splash some water on my face before I start doing this. Reasoning? Necessity. Habit. Yeah, I wanted to do habit. Interested what that could be in a philosophical sense. $665. One, two, three, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Whatever. Chapter 32, Habit. Introduction. The familiar word, habit, has a tremendous range of meaning. Some of its meaning is in technical discourse, are so divergent from one another, as well as from the popular understanding of the term, that it is difficult to find a common thread of derivation whereby to pass from one meaning to another. We can eliminate at once the use of the word to designate apparel, as when we speak of a riding habit. Yet even this sense contains root of meaning which cannot be dismissed. Augustine points out that the term habit is derived from the verb to have, and Aristotle, considering the meanings of to have, includes the sense in which a man may be said to have a coat or tunic, along with the sense in which a man may be said to have a habit, a piece of knowledge or a virtue, just as clothes are something a person has or possesses in a manner more or less fitting to the body. So habits, in the psychological sense, are qualities which a person has or possesses, and they too can be judged for their fitness. This understanding of habit is conveyed in the ancient remark, which has become a common expression, that habit is second nature. Habit is not original nature, but something added there too, as clothes are added to the body. But unlike clothes, which are added externally and merely by contact, habit has, as second nature, our nature itself transformed or developed. In the words of an ancient poet, whom Aristotle quotes with approval, habits but long practice, and this becomes men's nature in the end. Not all, as we shall see, would grant that practice is essential to habit. Nevertheless, the word practice suggests one notion that is common to all theories of acquired habit, namely, that habit is a retained effect, the result of something done or experienced. Within this common understanding, there are opposite views. According to one view, the acquisition of habits depends on activity. According to another, habits are modifications, passively, not actively acquired. The word habit is also used in a sense diametrically opposed to the meanings so far considered. It is the sense in which Aristotle, in the History of Animals, discusses the habits of animals and differentiates species according to the differences in their habits. Here the word habit is used to signify not an acquired pattern of behavior, but an innate predisposition to act or react in a certain way. The difference between acquired habits and the habits to which there is an innate tendency, James tells us, is marked by the fact that the latter generally are called instincts. The opposition between these two meanings of habit is clear. On the one hand, habits represent what, in the case of living things at least, is added by nature to nature, the results of experience, training, or activity. On the other hand, habits which are identical with instincts belong to original nature itself, part of the native endowment of the animal. Is there any common thread of meaning in the notions of acquired and innate habit which may explain the use of the word in such opposite senses? The familiar statement that a person does what he is in the habit of doing indicates that a habit is a tendency to a particular sort of behavior. Knowledge of a person's habits enables us to predict what he is likely to do in any situation which elicits habitual conduct on his part. So too, an animal's behavior in a particular situation may be predicted from a knowledge of its instincts. Instinct and habit, or innate and acquired habits, seem to have the common character that they are tendencies to behavior of a specific or determinate sort. They are definitely not random behavior. In the one case, the tendency is performed, part of the inherited nature of the organism. And the other, the tendency, is somehow a product of experience and learning. In neither case does habit refer to mere capacity for action, unformed and indeterminate, nor does it refer to the action, but rather the tendency to act. The modifiability of instincts by experience indicates another and more dynamic connection between innate and acquired habits. William James conceives innately determined behavior as if it were a plastic material out of which new patterns of conduct can be formed. The process of animal learning, he thinks, can be generally described as the replacement of instincts by habits. Most instincts, he writes, are implanted for the sake of giving rise to habits, and this purpose, once accomplished, the instincts themselves, as such, have no raison d'etre in the psychical economy, and consequently fade away. Some years before the Russian physiologists Betrevev and Pavlov experimentally studied the conditioning of reflexes, James described animal learning in terms of the substitution of new for old responses to stimuli, which had previously called forth an instinctive reaction, or in terms of the attachment of instinctive responses to new stimuli. The actions we call instinctive, James writes, all conform to the general reflex type, and are called forth by determinate sensory stimuli. For example, a predatory animal instinctively responsive to various perceptible signs of the whereabouts of its prey may learn to hunt for its food in a particular locality, at a particular time, and in a particular way. Or, to take the example James gives, if a child in his first attempt to pat a dog gets snapped at or bitten so that the impulse of fear is strongly aroused, it may be that for years to come no dog will excite in him the impulse to fondle again. Similarly, an animal which has no instinctive fear of man may acquire an habitual tendency to flee at man's approach as the result of experiences in which the appearance of man is associated with instinctively recognized signs of danger. In the classification of animals, from Aristotle on, the instincts peculiar to each species have been used in their differentiation. In addition, the degree to which the instincts of an animal are either relatively inflexible at one extreme or easily modifiable at the other has been thought to indicate that animal's rank in the scale of intelligence. Higher animals seem to have a greater capacity to form habits and to be capable, therefore, of modifying their instinctive patterns of behavior as the result of experience. In consequence, their behavior is both more adaptive and more variable than that of animals, which always follow the lines of action laid down by instinct. Species whose instincts are largely unmodifiable are at a disadvantage in a changing environment, or in one to which they are not innately adapted. In the struggle for existence, Darwin observes, it is the organism that varies ever so little, either in habits or structure, which gains an advantage over some other inhabitant of the same country. Though, for the most part, instincts seem to be directed toward the animal's survival, intelligence, or the power of modifying instincts by learning, may sometimes be needed to save the animal from his own instincts. If the lower animals are most dependent on their instincts and least able to modify them, that would seem to indicate a kind of opposition between instinct and intelligence. Darwin quotes Cuvier to the effect that instinct and intelligence stand in an inverse ratio to each other. But he himself does not wholly accept this view. He thinks that the behavior of beavers, for example, or of certain classes of insects, shows that a high degree of intelligence is certainly compatible with complex instincts. Yet he admits that it is not improbable that there is a certain amount of interference between the development of free intelligence and of instinct. On this subject of instinct in relation to intelligence or reason, James seems to take a less equivocal position. According to him, man possesses all the impulses that animals have, and a great many more besides. After enumerating what he considers to be the instinctive tendencies of the human species, he concludes by saying that no other mammal, not even the monkey, shows so large an array. But since James also thinks that man has the keenest intelligence, and may even be the only reasoning animal, he cannot believe that there is any material antagonism between instinct and reason. On the contrary, a high development of the faculties of memory, of associating ideas, and of making inferences implies not the absence of instinct, but the modifiability of instinct by experience and learning. Though the animals richest in reason might be also the animal richest in instinctive impulses too, James writes he would never seem the fatal automaton which a merely instinctive animal would be. The fatal automaton. The opposite position is taken by those who, like Cuvier, hold that the more adequate an animal's instinctive equipment is for its survival, the less it needs free intelligence for adaptive purposes, and the less important is the role of learning and habit formation. Some writers, like Aquinas, go further than this and maintain that, in the case of man, the power of reason as an instrument of learning and of solving life's problems supplants instinct almost entirely, or needs to be supplemented by instinctive impulses of an extremely rudimentary sort, hardly more complex than simple reflexes. What other animals do by instinct, man does by reason. Brute animals, Aquinas writes, do not act at the command of reason, but if they are left to themselves, such animals act from natural instinct, since, in his opinion, habits can be formed only by acts which involve reason as a factor. He does not think that, strictly speaking, habits are to be found in brutes, but he adds, to the extent that man's reason may influence brutes by a sort of conditioning to do things in this or that way, so in this sense, to a certain extent, we can admit the existence of habits in brute animals. The modification of instincts in the course of individual life raises a question about their modifiability from generation to generation. The question has obvious significance for the theory of evolution. It is thought by some that an animal's instincts represent the past experience of the race. In a passage quoted by James, Herbert Spencer, for example, maintains that reflex actions and instincts result from the registration of experience continued for numberless generations. Freud appears to hold much the same opinion. All organic instincts are conservative, he writes. They are historically acquired and are directed towards regressions, towards reinstatement of something earlier. Indeed, he claims that the instincts of living things revert back beyond ancestral history to the inorganic. They go back to an ancient starting point, which the living being left long ago. They are an imprint left upon the development of the organism by the evolution of our Earth and its relation to the Sun. James, on the other hand, claims that there is perhaps not one single unequivocal item of positive proof in favor of the view that adaptive changes are inherited. He thinks the variability of instincts from generation to generation must be accounted for by some other means than the inheritance of acquired characteristics, according to which the habits acquired by earlier generations gradually become, through hereditary transmission, the innate habits of later generations. The question of their origin aside, What is the structure of instincts? In the chapter on emotion, where this matter is considered, instinctive behavior is described as having three components. It involves, first, an innate ability to recognize certain objects. Second, an emotional reaction to them, which includes an impulse to act in a certain way. And third, the ability to execute that impulse without benefit of learning. James covers two of these 3 points when he defines an instinct as, quote, the faculty of acting in such a way as to produce certain ends, without foresight of the ends, and without previous education in the performance. And he touches on the remaining one when he declares that instinctive reactions and emotional expressions shade imperceptibly into each other. Every object that excites an instinct, he goes on to say, excites an emotion as well, but emotions fall short of instincts in that the emotional reaction usually terminates in the subject's own body, whilst the instinctive reaction is apt to go further and enter into practical relations with the exciting object. In the discussion of instincts, from Aristotle to Freud, the emphasis on one or another of these components has varied from time to time. Medieval psychologists, if we take Aquinas as an example, seems to stress the cognitive aspect. He speaks of the sheep running away when it sees the wolf, not because of its color or shape, but as a natural enemy. The point which he thinks notable here is not the fact that the sheep runs away, but rather the fact that without any previous experience of wolves, the sheep recognizes the wolf as dangerous. The sheep, seeing the wolf, judges it a thing to be shunned, not from deliberation, but from natural instinct. This instinctive power of recognizing what is to the animal's advantage or peril, Aquinas calls the estimative power, and assigns it, along with memory and imagination, to the sensitive faculty. Later writers stress the emotional and connotative aspects of instinct, feeling, and impulse. James, for example, indicates this emphasis when he says that every instinct is an impulse, and Freud makes desire central rather than perception or action. An instinct, he says, may be described as a stimulus, but it would be more exact to speak of, quote, a stimulus of instinctual origin as a need, period. The instincts are the basic cravings or needs, and these instinctual needs are the primary unconscious determinants of behavior and thought. What Freud calls instinctual needs seem to be the counterpart of what, in an earlier phase of the tradition, are called natural desires. These two notions are far from being strictly interchangeable, but they do have a certain similarity in their reference to desires which are not conscious or acquired through experience. This matter is further discussed in the chapter on desire. If we turn now to the consideration of habit as something acquired by the individual, we find two major issues. The first of these has already been mentioned in connection with the conception of habit as a retained effect. According to William James, the capacity for habit formation is a general property of nature, found in inanimate matter as well as in living things. The moment one tries to define what habit is, he writes, one is led to the fundamental properties of matter. He regards the laws of nature, for example, as nothing but the immutable habits which the different elementary sorts of matter follow in their actions and reactions upon each other. In the organic world, however, the habits are more variable than this. James attributes this universal capacity for habit formation to what he calls the plasticity of matter, which consists in, quote, the possession of a structure weak enough to yield to an influence, but strong enough not to yield all at once. Each relatively stable phase of equilibrium in such a structure is marked by what we may call a new set of habits. He cites as examples of habit formation in inorganic matter such things as the magnetizing of an iron bar, the setting of plaster, scratches on a polished surface, or creases in a piece of cloth. The matter in each of these cases is not only plastic and yielding, but retentive through its inertia. When the structure has yielded, he writes, the same inertia becomes the condition of its comparative permanence in the new form, and of the new habits the body then manifests. The habits of living things, or of the human mind, are to be regarded only as special cases of nature's general plasticity and retentiveness. James does not fail to observe the difference between the magnetized bar, the scratched surface, or the creased cloth, and the habits of a trained animal or a skilled workman. The latter are acquired by activity, by practicing the same acts repeatedly. Furthermore, they are not merely passive relics of a past impression, but are themselves tendencies to action. They erupt into action almost spontaneously when the occasion for performance arises. It may be questioned whether the word habit should be used so broadly. Unlike James, most writers restrict its application to living things, and even there, they limit habit formation to the sphere of learning. If the capacity to learn from experience is not a property of plant life, then plants cannot form habits. The same may be said of certain species of animals whose activity is entirely and inflexibly instinctive. Habits are possessed only by those organisms, animals or men, whose future conduct can be determined by their own past behavior. Future conduct can be determined by their own past behavior. What the heck was that? Aquinas, as we have seen, goes further than this and limits habit formation in a strict sense to man alone. This leads at once to the second issue. For those who believe that man is not specifically different from all other animals, man's habits and his habit formation require no special distinction or analysis. They hold that human intelligence differs from animal intelligence only in degree, not in kind. No other factors, they think, are present in human learning than those which operate when animals somehow profit from experience or acquire new modes of behavior. In the great books, there is to be found, however, a very special theory of habit, which is part of the doctrine that man is specifically different from all other animals, in that he alone is rational and has free will. The issue about man's nature is discussed in other chapters, Animal, Evolution, and Man, Mind. Here we must examine the consequences for the theory of habit of those opposing views. Do animals and men form habits in the same sense of that term? The use of the word is not at stake, for habit may be used in a different sense for the acquired dispositions of animals. Those who hold that brute animals and men do not have habits in the same sense acknowledge that men may have, in addition to their specifically human habits, the sort of modified instincts or conditioned reflexes which are typical of animal habit formation. Furthermore, it is recognized that human and animal habits are alike in certain respects. Both are acquired by activity, and both are tendencies to activity of a determinate sort. The question, therefore, is simply this: does one conception of habit apply to men and animals, or does human nature require a special conception applicable to man alone? To clarify this issue, it is necessary to summarize the analysis of human habits, which Aristotle and Aquinas develop more fully than other writers, even than those who share their view of the rationality and freedom of man. That Aristotle and Aquinas should be the authors of an elaborate theory of human habits becomes intelligible in terms of two facts. In the first place, they consider habit in the context of moral theory. For them, the virtues, moral or intellectual, are habits, and so necessarily are the opposite vices. Virtues are good habits, vices bad habits. Hence, good or bad, human habits must be so formed and constituted that they can have the moral quality connoted by virtue or vice. Since virtue is praiseworthy and vice blameworthy only if their possessor is responsible, human habit is conceived as arising from freely chosen acts. In the second place, their understanding of habit is affected by their psychological doctrine of faculties, and especially by their analysis of the powers and activities which they think belong peculiarly to man. This in turn gives a metaphysical meaning to habit, for they treat human powers and human acts as special cases of potentiality and actualization. Aquinas bases much of his discussion of habit on Aristotle's definition of it as a disposition whereby that which is disposed well or ill. And this, either in regard to itself or in regard to another, is calling a habit a disposition. Aristotle goes on to say that all dispositions are not necessarily habits, for while dispositions are unstable or ephemeral habits, are ephemeral habits are permanent, or at least difficult to alter. For a disposition to be a habit, certain other conditions must be present, according to Aquinas. That which is disposed should be distinct from that to which it is disposed, he writes, and hence should be related to it as potentiality is to act. If there is a being which lacks all potentiality, he points out, we can find no room in such a thing for habit, as is clearly the case in God. Being which lacks all potentiality. It is also necessary that, quote, that which is in a state of potentiality in regard to something else be capable of determination in several ways into various things. If there were a potentiality which could be actualized in one way and one way only, then such a power of operation could not be determined by habits. Some of man's powers seem to be of this sort. His faculty of sensation, for example, functions perfectly when the sense organs have normally matured. A man does not learn to see colors or to hear tones, and so the simple use of his senses, apart from aesthetic perceptions and trained discriminations, does not lead to sensory habits. The exterior apprehensive powers as sight, hearing, and the like, Aquinas maintains, are not susceptive of habits, but are ordained to their fixed acts, according to the disposition of their nature. In contrast, man's faculty of thinking and knowing can be improved or perfected by activity and exercise. The words improved and perfected are misleading if they are thought to exclude bad habits, for a bad habit is no less a habit than a good one. The definition of habit, Aquinas points out, includes dispositions which, quote, dispose the subject well or ill to its form or to its operation. Hence, when we say that the power of operation is improved or perfected by being exercised, we must mean only that after a number of particular acts, the individual has a more determinate capacity for definite operation than he had before. A man may have at birth the mere capacity for knowing grammar or geometry. But after he has learned these subjects, he has the habit of such knowledge. This, according to Aristotle and Aquinas, means that his original capacity has been rendered more determinate in its activity. It would be so even if he had learned errors. That is, even if the intellectual habits he had formed disposed his mind in a manner which would be called ill rather than well. The difference between a man who has learned grammar and one who has not is a difference in their capacity for a certain intellectual performance, a difference resulting from the intellectual work which has been done by the man who has learned grammar. That difference is an intellectual habit. The man who has not learned grammar has the same undeveloped capacity for knowing grammar with which he was born. The man who has learned grammar has had his native capacity for grammatical knowledge developed. That developed capacity is a habit of knowledge or skill which manifests itself in the way in which he writes and speaks. But even when he is not actually exercising his grammatical skill, the fact that he has formed this particular habit means that he will be able, whenever the occasion arises, to do correctly with speed and facility what the man who does not have the habit cannot do readily or easily, if he can do it at all. It may be helpful to illustrate the same points by reference to a bodily habit such as gymnastics or athletic skill, which, being an art, is a habit not of body alone, but of mind as well. If two men are born with normal bodies, equally capable of certain muscular coordinations, they stand in the same relation to performing on the tennis court. Both are equally able to learn the game, but when one of them has learned to play, his acquired skill consists in the trained capacity for the required acts or motions. The other man may be able to perform all these acts or go through all these motions, but not with the same facility and grace, or as pleasantly as the man whose mastery of the game lies in a habit formed by much practice in doing what is required. As the habit gradually grows, awkwardness is overcome, speed increases, and pleasure in performance replaces pain or difficulty. Clearly, then, the habit exists even when it is not in operation. It may even develop during periods of inactivity. As William James remarks, there is a sense in which we learn to swim during the winter and to skate during the summer, when we are not actually engaging in these sports. This would seem to be inconsistent with the general insight common to all observers that habits are strengthened by exercise and weakened or broken by disuse or by the performance of contrary acts. But James explains that his point, stated less paradoxically, means only that during periods of rest, the effects of prior activity seem to consolidate and build up a habit. The dynamism of habit formation and habitual activity is summarized in the language of Aristotle and Aquinas by the statement that habit is a kind of medium between mere power and mere act. On the one hand, a habit is like a power or capacity, for though it is an improvement on native ability, it is still only an ability to perform certain acts. It is not the actual performance of them. On the other hand, habit is like operation or activity, for it represents an actualization or development of capacity, even as a particular operation is an actualization of the power to act. That is why habit is sometimes called a second grade of potentiality, compared to natural capacity as first potentiality, and also a first grade of actuality, compared to operation as complete act. According to the theory of specifically human habits, habits are situated only in man's powers of reason and will. Habits are formed in the other powers only to the extent that they are subject to direction by his reason and will. Specifically, human habits can be formed only in that area of activity in which men are free to act or not to act, and when they act, free to act this way or that. Habit, the product of freedom, is not thought of as abolishing freedom. However difficult it may be to exert a free choice against a strong habit, even the strongest habit is not conceived as unbreakable, and if it is breakable, it must permit action contrary to itself. Habitual behavior only seems to lack freedom because a man does habitually, without conscious attention to details, what he would be forced to do by conscious choice at every step if he lacked the habit. In the theory under consideration, habits are classified according to the faculty which they determine or perfect, on the ground that every power which may be variously directed to act needs a habit whereby it is well disposed to its act. Consequently, there are intellectual habits, or habits of thinking and knowing, and appetitive habits, or habits of desire, which involve the emotions and the will and usually entail specific types of conduct. Within a single faculty, such as the intellect, habits are further differentiated by reference to their objects or to the end to which their characteristic operation is directed. For example, the habit of knowing, which consists in a science like geometry, and the habit of artistic performance, such as skill in grammar, both belong to the intellect, but they are distinct habits according to their objects or ends. All of these distinctions have moral as well as psychological significance. They are used in formulating the criteria of good and bad habits, which are more appropriately discussed in the chapter on virtue and vice. But here, one further psychological distinction deserves comment. Some of man's acquired habits are regarded as natural in a special sense, not in the sense in which instincts are called natural or innate habits. The distinction is drawn from the supposition that certain habits develop in all men, because since human nature is the same for all, men will inevitably form these habits if they act at all. This word, natural, here applied to a habit, simply means that it is common to all, having the same nature. For example, the understanding of the law of contradiction, that the same thing cannot be affirmed and denied at the same time, and other simple axioms of theoretic knowledge are said to be possessed by the human mind as a matter of natural habit. If a man thinks at all, he will come to know these truths. It is owing to the very nature of the intellectual soul, Aquinas writes, that man, having once grasped what is a whole and what is a part, should at once perceive that every whole is larger than its part. The sense in which Aquinas says that the understanding of first principles is called a natural habit applies to the first principles of the practical reason, as well as to the axioms of theoretic knowledge. Just as no man who makes theoretic judgments about the true and false can be, in his opinion, without habitual knowledge of the principle of contradiction, so he thinks no man who makes practical judgments about good and evil can be without habitual knowledge of the natural moral law, the first principle of which is that the good is to be sought and evil avoided. Since the precepts of the natural law are sometimes considered by reason actually, Aquinas writes, while sometimes they are in the reason only habitually. In the same way, the natural law may be called a habit. In a different phase of the tradition, Hume regards it as an inevitable tendency of the human mind to interpret any repeated sequence of events in terms of cause and effect. If one thing has preceded another a certain number of times in our experience, we are likely to infer that if the first occurs, the second will follow. The principle which determines us to form such a conclusion is, Hume says, custom or habits. All our inferences from experience are, quote, effects of custom, not of reasoning, and since the habit of inferring a future connection between things which have been customarily conjoined in the past is, in his opinion, universally present in human nature, Hume refers to it as, quote, a species of natural instinct which no reasoning or process of thought and understanding is able either to produce or prevent. Even Kant's synthetic judgments a priori have a certain similarity to the thing called natural habit. Period. They comprise judgments the mind will make because of its own nature, or, in Kant's terms, its transcendental structure. Though a priori, the judgment itself is not innate, for it arises only when actual experience provides its subject matter. So, too, the natural habit of first principles, of which Aquinas speaks, is not innate, but a result of experience. There is still one other traditional meaning of the phrase natural habit. It occurs in Christian theology. Habits are there distinguished according as they are acquired by man's own efforts, or are a gift of God's grace, which add to or elevate human nature. The former are natural, the latter supernatural. In the sphere of supernatural habits, the theologian makes a distinction between grace itself and the special habits which accompany grace. Aquinas, for example, writes that just as the natural light of reason is something different from the acquired virtues which are ordained to this natural light, so also the light of grace, which is a participation of the divine nature, and something different is something different from the infused virtues which are derived from and ordained to this light. These infused virtues, like the natural virtues, are good habits, principles of operation, determining acts of thought or desire. They are either the specifically theological virtues of faith, hope, and charity, or the supernatural counterparts of the acquired intellectual and moral virtues. The habits, which are called the infused virtues, and the moral and intellectual gifts. Grace, taken in itself rather than in its consequences, is not an operative habit. That is, it is not a habit of performing certain acts. Nevertheless, regarded as something added to and perfecting nature, it is considered under the aspect of habit. But rather than, quote, a habit whereby power is inclined to act, Aquinas includes it among those habits by which the nature is well or ill disposed to something, and chiefly when such a disposition has become a sort of nature. Through the habit of grace, man's nature is elevated by becoming, quote, a partaker, of the divine nature. To distinguish this kind of habit from those in the operative order, it is sometimes called an initiative habit, a habit of the very being of man's personality. On the purely natural plane, health may be thought of in the same way as a habit, which is initiative rather than operative. It is a habit not of thought, desire, or conduct, but of man's physical being. The word custom is sometimes a synonym for habit, and sometimes a variant with special connotations. What a man does habitually is customary for him to do. So far as the single individual is concerned, there seems to be no difference between habit and custom, but we usually think of custom in terms of the group or community rather than the individual. It is indicated in the chapter on custom and convention. The prevailing modes of behavior in a society and its widely shared beliefs represent common habits of thought and action on the part of its members, apart from the habits of individuals. Social customs have no existence whatsoever. But social custom and individual habits cannot be equated, because with respect to any customary practice or opinion, there may be non-conforming individuals, men of divergent habit. The prevalent or predominant customs are the habits of the majority. No society endures for long or functions peacefully unless common habits generate the ties of custom. To perpetuate itself, the state necessarily attempts to mold habits of each growing generation by every means of education, by tradition, by law. So important is the stability of custom in the life of society, according to Montaigne, that it is, quote, very unjust to subject public and established customs and institutions to the weakness and instability of a private and particular fancy. He doubts whether any so manifest benefit can accrue from the alteration of a law received, let it be what it will, as there is danger and inconvenience in altering it. His extreme caution with regard to changing the law comes from a preference for the stability of settled customs and from the recognition that
Quote, government is a structure composed of diverse parts and members joined and united together with so strict connection that it is impossible to stir so much as one brick or stone, but the whole body will be sensible of it. Without habits of action, at least, neither the individual nor society can avoid chaos. Habits bind day to day in a continuity which would be lost if the recurring problems of conduct or thought had to be solved anew each time they arose. Without habits, life would become unbearably burdensome. It would bog down under the weight of making decisions. Without habits, men could not live with themselves, much less with one another. Habits are, as William James remarks, the flywheel of society. And all the references. Additional readings. I'm liking this Mortimer Adler content. It's sort of I don't know, repetitive in its structure of just discussing one idea over and over, one different idea each time. But that's fine, because at least it's the fact that it's a different idea is what makes it interesting. And it's the way it's written. I enjoy reading the way the ideas about the ideas kind of flow together. That's probably the bigger thing I'm doing, is learning from Mortimer Adler's mind via his writing than I am anything in particular with regards to history or literature. But also I am learning some stuff about history and literature, which is cool. Especially if I ever get that gateway to the great books set. I wish I could look at the appendices. Oh, here we go. Contents. Volume 1, Introduction, some topical guide, letter to the reader. Appendices, a plan of graded reading. recommended novels, recommended anthologies of poetry. Volume 2, Imaginative Literature, Daniel Defoe, excerpts from Robinson Crusoe. Rudyard Kipling, Mowgli's Brothers from Jungle Book. Victor Hugo, The Battle with the Cannon from 93. Guy de Maupassant, Two Friends. Ernest Hemingway, The Killers from Men Without Women. Sir Walter Scott, The Two Drovers, Chronicles of the Canongate. Joseph Conrad, Youth. Voltaire, Micromegas. Oscar Wilde, The Happy Prince. Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart. Robert Louis Stevenson's Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Mark Twain, a.k.a. Samuel Clemens, The Man That Corrupted Hadleyburg. Charles Dickens, A Full and Faithful Report of the Memorable Trial of Bardell against Pickwick, from the Pickwick Papers. Nikolai Gogol, The Overcoat. Samuel Butler, Customs and Opinions of the Erowhonians, from Erewhonians. Sherwood Anderson, quote, I'm a fool. Anonymous. Aucassin and Nicolette. Medieval French fictional story. Unique example of sung story. Imaginative Literature Part 2. Stephen Crane, The Open Boat. Herman Melville, Billy Budd. Ivan Bunin, The Gentleman from San Francisco. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Rappaccini's Daughter. George Eliot, The Lifted Veil. Lucius Apuleius, Cupid and Psyche from the Golden Ass. Ivan Turgenev, First Love. Fyodor Dostoevsky, White Nights. I read that. John Galsworthy, The Apple Tree. It's in that right there. Gustave Flaubert, The Legend of St. Julian the Hospitaller. F. Scott Fitzgerald, The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. Of course, that's the title of his story. Honore de Balzac, A Passion in the Desert. Anton Chekhov, The Darling. Isaac Singer, The Spinoza of Market Street. Alexander Pushkin, The Queen of Spades. D.H. Lawrence, The Rocking Horse Winner. Henry James, The Pupil. Thomas Mann, Mario and the Magician. Isaac Dinenson, Sorrow Acre. Leo Tolstoy, The Death of Ivan Ilyich. The Three Hermits. What Men Live By. Imaginative Literature 3. Molière, The Misanthrope. A Doctor in Spite of Himself. Richard Brinsley Sheridan, The School for Scandal. Henrik Ibsen, An Enemy of the People. Anton Chekhov, The Cherry Orchard. George Bernard Shaw, The Man of Destiny. John Synge, Riders to the Sea. Eugene O'Neill, The Emperor Jones. Volume 5, Critical Essays. Virginia Woolf, How Should One Read a Book? Matthew Arnold, The Study of Poetry, Sweetness and Light. Charles Augustine, Saint Beuve, What is a Classic? Montaigne, Francis Bacon, Of Beauty, of Discourse, of Studies. David Hume, Of the Standard of Taste. Arthur Schopenhauer, On Style, On Some Forms of Literature, On the Comparative Place of Interest and Beauty in Works of Art. Friedrich Schiller, On Simple and Sentimental Poetry,
Percy Bysshe Shelley, A Defense of Poetry. Walt Whitman, Preface to Leaves of Grass. William Hazlitt, My First Acquaintance with Poets, on Swift, of Persons One Would Wish to Have Seen. Charles Lamb, My First Play, Dream Children, A Reverie, Sanity of True Genius. Samuel Johnson, Preface to Shakespeare. Thomas de Quincey, Literature of Knowledge and Literature of Power, On the Knocking at the Gate in Macbeth. T.S. Eliot, Dante, Tradition and the Individual Talent. That would be an interesting volume to read, critical essays. Six, Man in Society. Mark Twain, Learning the River from Life on the Mississippi. I read that. Probably. Remember it. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau, I've read that. Walt Whitman, Death of Abraham Lincoln. Tacitus, The Life of Gnaeus Julius Agricola. Great Documents, English Bill of Rights, Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, Virginia Declaration of Rights, Declaration of Independence, Charter of the United States, Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Thomas Paine, A Call to Patriots, December 23rd, 1776. George Washington, a circular letter to the governors of all the states on disbanding the army, the farewell address. Benjamin Franklin, proposal for promoting useful knowledge among the British plantations in America. Jean de Crèville, Alexis de Tocqueville, Henry David Thoreau, Abraham Lincoln, Man in Society, Francis Bacon, Jonathan Swift, David Hume, Plutarch. Natural Science, Francis Bacon, The Sphinx. Mathematics, Mirror of Civilization. In Life and Thought, Mathematical Method, Study of Mathematics, Definition of Number, Fingerprints. Volume 10, Philosophical Essays. Cicero, Plutarch. Epictetus, Epicurus, Epicurus. John Dewey, The Process of Thought, William James. Okay, so this is sort of like maybe slightly easier to understand. Lessons from literature. Included an index similar to the great books in Topcon, along with reading plans of increasing difficulty. Hutchins wrote an introduction with a more informal tone than he used in the Great Conversation, his preface to the great books, and that chiefly explained the relevance of most of the categories making up the set: the imagination of man, about fiction and drama, Man in Society, Science and Mathematics, and Philosophy. The set contained biographical notes on the various authors, similar to those in the great books. However, the set also contained editorial introductions to these selections, which were generally not included in the great books. In another departure from the great book series, the set included black and white drawings of most of the authors by Chicago portraitist Fred Steffen, who also wrote brief notes describing the illustrations. Details with a number of these drawings were featured on the volume covers. Although the editors maintained that, and they're kind of like wacky, it's almost like Hunter S. Thompson's pal, the Englishman, the illustrator. Although the editors maintained that many selections were appropriate to readers as young as 7th grade students, the set included a fair amount of material challenging for the most experienced reader. The gateway volumes were single column with large readable type. That's good to know. Yeah, maybe that wouldn't be what I'm looking for. Maybe I should just keep doing what I'm doing. And I just like that it included so much stuff from the more contemporary novelists. Like Hemingway and Fitzgerald and Dostoevsky. Mark Twain, Charles Dickens, Joseph Conrad, Daniel Defoe. He's not contemporary, but the more writery types of writers, guys that were just like trying to make a living as an artist and not like trying to contribute to the great conversation. Celebrate the holidays sustainably. Have to sustain this. I must sustain it.